Okay, welcome everyone to our second virtual job market workshop. We're very excited to have so many of you here. We know that the job market is a stressful time for many graduate students, and the goal of each of our workshops is to demystify this process and provide you with helpful suggestions on how to succeed in the job market. This session will focus on presentation preparation. Today's workshop as a whole will focus on both presentation and interview preparation. So to start off, we're very happy to have Paul Goldsmith-Pinkham from Yale University and Arik Levinson from Georgetown University discussing how to put together and deliver a successful presentation. So here's how this session will work. First, each of our speakers will take about 30 minutes presenting their thoughts. Then we will have up to 45 minutes for questions and answers. So as you listen to the speakers, please prepare your questions. I will be then moderating the Q&A. And so with no further ado, I will turn it over to Arik after making him co-host so he can share the slides. Go ahead, Arik.
Okay, thank you, Tatiana. Let me share a slide and jump in. And already stuck because I want to share this big screen. You'd think 2 years into this pandemic, we would have this figured out. And
maybe just click on switch share.
No, the slideshow tab, I think, is where.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to get to the slideshow. I will figure it out.
Oh, I see. It's a input thing. Got it.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, are we in business?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I should say to everyone, in way of thanks to Tatiana, I've always admired Tatiana's service to the profession. She's always working on things like this that are helpful to graduate students and colleagues and the profession at large. And so I've always admired that about her. And this combines that with service to another worthy cause. And so this is sort of, I was going to say a two-edged sword, but that makes it sound like a bad thing. This is a double bonus. So congratulations on this bank shot. Of the talk on the webpage is how to give an effective job market paper. And she, in the introduction, said how to give a successful job market talk. And that puts a lot of pressure on me. And so, you know, the stakes seem kind of high. First of all, who am I to tell you how to give a good job talk? I've given my share of lousy talks. And second, you know, the stakes are high. If I do a bad job of presenting today, that undermines the message I would be trying to give. So what I thought I would do is instead give a talk about how to give a horrible job talk, because I know something about that. I've seen lots of them. And plus, if I do a bad job this morning, that's just proof of concept. So the message today is things not to do. And I'll weave in some things to do, basically, from seeing decades and decades of job talks that go well and job talks that don't go well. So the first thing you want to do if you want to give a horrible job talk is make sure the first slide is super boring. I've seen lots of these. This is an example of one. It's got lots of information that you either already know or don't need to know. It's got an email address. Nobody ever writes down an email address to send to the author. It's got the date. People know that. And it's got lots of information on the bottom that are going to go forward throughout the talk, including what slide we're on, the title again, the date again. Why do we need to crowd up your slide with that information? Any time people's eyeballs spend on that information is time they don't spend, their eyeballs don't spend on the information that you want them to be looking at. And by the way, the little ticker at the bottom that says slide 1 of 47, I find very distracting. I don't know how others feel about it, but I find it's very tense as the slide progresses. And I'm looking at my watch thinking, are they going to get through? Here we are in minute 70 of their talk, and we're still only on slide 10 of 47. I can't concentrate on the talk if that's what I'm looking at. Here are some opening slides that I've used that I've liked. This is one I liked a lot. I gave a paper about California energy efficiency years ago, and I put the key graph. So at the end of the day, the graph that I want people to remember is this picture, and I'm going to come back to it and build up to it in the graph, and I'm going to end with it at the end of the talk. And so I hope when people go home, they remember this graph. So I'm going to start with it. It's not explained yet, but in the talk, it's going to be explained. And then I put on the slide quotes from a lot of people who read my paper and don't believe it. And so it's a little bit entertaining. People are going to look at the opening slide and want to know why the Consumer Federation of America thought this was a misleading and wrong study, or why the paper reads as though the author has never been to California. Here's another one I did recently with Matt Kotchen. We had a little bit of a dispute about the title. Matt won, and the title is "When Can Benefit Cost Analysis Ignore Secondary Markets?" which I think is what the paper was about, but it's a little bit boring. And I wanted to call it "Ignoring Secondary Markets Without Apology," which is a reference to an old paper by Willig called "Consumer Surplus Without Apology." Here's another one I recently wrote about fuel economy standards of cars, and it's about why the federal legislation would save car owners money. And so I just put a picture of President Biden signing the executive order that claimed that the fuel economy standards that the Department of Transportation promulgated would save American households $900, even though the cars cost more. So that's the kind of thing I like to do with opening slides. Second thing you want to do if you want to give a boring job talk is make sure that you put one of these outline slides. What you'll see in this outline slide is information that is basically no different than any other talk ever given by anybody, right? Introduction, model, data, results, conclusions. Unless you're doing things backwards or presenting a bunch of different information, we don't need that slide. That's the way most job talks proceed. In fact, I'm on a mission to purge those paragraphs from papers as well. The end of introductions always say, this paper proceeds as follows. Section 2 presents the model, Section 3 presents the data, Section 4 presents conclusions, Section 5 presents, and so on. It's not informative. Again, unless you're doing something different. Like this paper is going to be different. I'm going to start with some empirical results, and then I'm going to present a model that explains those empirical results. That would be informative. No, what I strive for is that after the first 5 minutes of a talk, people should know the following 5 things. They should know very clearly what your research question is. They should know why that is important. They should know a little bit about what we know so far from prior research. They should know how what you're going to do is different from the prior results. And they should know something about what your results tell you. So that if they check out after 5 minutes because they leave the room, or because they start looking at their phones, or because their mind wanders, or they get lost in some technical detail of what you're doing, they know what your paper's about. And when they go home that evening and their spouse or their roommate says, hey, how was the job talk today? They can say, here's why it was important, and here's what the results are. Okay, back to giving horrible talks. One thing you want to do if you giving horrible job talks is make sure you have unreadable slides. This is a picture of a Nobel laureate giving a horrible talk. If you have a Nobel Prize in economics, you can do that. In fact, it's probably wise, because if nobody can read your slides and you're a Nobel laureate, people give you the benefit of the doubt, and they assume there's a bunch of brilliant stuff there that they just can't read. If you're on the job market, you can't get away with this. Now, one way to make sure that your slides are unreadable is to just cut and paste tables from the paper. That has the benefit of being easy, but it makes them unreadable. There's lots of small numbers, including footnotes is always a good thing to do if you want to make sure your slides are unreadable. Nobody needs to read footnotes on tables in slides. What I like to do if I'm trying not to give a horrible talk is just highlight some selected statistics. So this means I have to retype a table that's for this talk rather than for the paper. And I've put in there, I've included standard errors because otherwise people would ask, but I've kind of grayed them out or made them smaller because that's not what I want people to focus on. I've highlighted the statistics I'm going to talk about. Basically, if you're not going to be talking about things or expect people to ask about them, you probably don't need to put them in a slide. And I've highlighted a couple of things. And then I move on to the next slide and I've highlighted different things in that same column. So basically everything in that column is something that I'm going to mention in the talk, with the exception of, the number of observations in the R squareds, which is probably something people's eyes would wander to for good reason. If they ask about other stuff, I can bring it up. I've got an ancillary slide which has more things on it. But if I want people to focus on these particular statistics, and then I'm going to compare that regression to another one, I move on to the next column and I highlight the features of that column which are new. And I've left the old information grayed out so people can go back to them, but I want to draw people's attention to the new column. If you just put up the whole table and then start talking, people are not going to know what particular piece of information you're talking about. So that takes a little bit of work, but I think it makes the talks go better and be more effective. One thing I like, if you're in the business of giving a horrible job topic is hydrating constantly. Maybe these are a couple of pet peeves of mine. I don't know what it is about our profession that we can't give an hour-long talk without rehydrating. In fact, I've seen people at 20-minute American Economic Association talks with a liter bottle of water needing to hydrate. If you have a well-functioning or moderately well-functioning human body, you can probably go without it. A second pet peeve of mine is the use of the laser pointer. These are not so common anymore, but if you're standing next to the board, you probably don't need a laser pointer. In fact, if you're in a big auditorium and the screen is far away, maybe using a laser pointer is a good thing to do, but a better strategy is make your slides clear enough so that it's obvious what you're talking about from the slide by having the circles and so forth. If you're using a laser pointer or pointing at the slides, it's probably a sign that your slides aren't designed well enough to be clear. Here's a picture of me not using a laser pointer, using instead my digits rather than I call this an analog laser pointer. All right. Actually, I called that me failing to give a horrible job talk. You don't know that the job talk wasn't horrible. I'm just not using a laser pointer. A key ingredient to a horrible job talk is lots and lots of bullet points with no graphics. And to illustrate that point, I've provided a slide with lots and lots of bullet points. Each of them has, I think some lessons that I try to follow when I'm giving a talk. First one is to assume that nobody has read the paper. I think of all the assumptions you'll make in your model, that's probably the one that's verifiably true. Second, don't give talks about the literature. I'm less interested in papers that say, Goldsmith, Pinkham, and Levinson show X, I'm going to show Y. Well, that's just a dispute between pointy-headed economists. Say, here's an important piece of information about the world. Prior research has said X, my paper is going to show Y. But lead with the question, not with the literature. I also don't like to hear papers that are about building models. You'll see a lot of abstracts that start, I build a model of the Greek economy that's dynamic and stochastic and has game theory. theoretic components in the following way. What's the question you're using this, describe the research question and say why you need to build a model to answer that question. So start with the story. Next bullet point is, I think, particularly important for job talks as opposed to regular seminars, but they're important to general seminars too, especially for broad audience. Speak to the generalist. So your introduction should be accessible to a good undergraduate economics major in the room if possible, certainly an early graduate student. Any macroeconomist, microeconomist, econometrician, environmental economist should understand the introduction, why it's important, what you're doing, what the strategy is, and what the takeaway is. And then when you go into the details, you can start getting into the specifics that you may lose a few people if you're a specialist. But in the first 5 minutes, you should really, any well-trained economist or even partly trained economist should be able to understand what you're doing. That's a goal anyway. Turning to slide hygiene, this is, I think, common sense. Large font. You hear a lot of people in talks say, I apologize for the small font. I know you can't read this in the back of the room. If you're saying that, it just means you didn't prepare your slides well enough. Have a large font. Don't put too many words. If there are words on the slide that you don't need, eliminate them. Don't have too many slides. If you have more than a slide a minute, it's way too many. And my mantra, which I always tell graduate students preparing the job market, is that your slides are not your speaking notes. If you need speaking notes, those are a separate document. If you are reading from your slides, you are doing something that your audience can do by themselves. Your audience is capable of reading your slides faster and with more comprehension than if they listen to you read them. So there's no reason for you to be reading words off of the page, off of the screen. And this is particularly, I think, important for people who are new to public speaking or for whom English is a second language. You may not have confidence that when you get in front of a bunch of people, you're going to remember what you wanted to say. So that's fine. Write them down on a piece of paper and have them in front of you. Don't have them on the board for everyone to read. You're replicating. So, another way of saying that mantra is your slide should be complementary to what you're saying, not a substitute for what you're saying. If they're a substitute, people are either reading your slides or listening to you, not both. Most of us, I certainly, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I don't have the multitasking capabilities to be able to listen and comprehend and read and comprehend at the same time. So if I'm either doing one or the other. Plan to end early. If you end your talk 5 minutes early, nobody will complain. If you are running late, people will not be thinking about what you're saying. They will only be thinking about what they're late for in the next item in their busy day. And then I said this before, but it's worth repeating. End with your takeaway. You want people to go home and say, you know what? I learned something really cool today. I didn't know this before, but now I know the following fact about the world. And that's what you want to end with. Don't end with my future projects or caveats or other papers I'm working on. End with what the lesson you want people to know, because you want them to remember you and remember you for something interesting that they learned. If they remember you for something interesting that they learned, there's promise that they will learn other interesting things from you. You don't have to go into the details in the job talk. I promised to spend a little time on audience questions. I think I put audience questions into 3 buckets. One is people are just kind of showing off what they know and what they and how smart they are, and that's fine. Give them room to do that. Have a piece of paper, write down, either write down what they are saying or pretend to write down what they're saying, and acknowledge the point. That's an excellent point. I hadn't thought of it quite that way, but that's a good way of framing it, or that's an interesting angle on it. There's no harm in acknowledging other ways of seeing the world. Some of these are not actually questions, and then it's a little hard when they turn the floor back to you what you should be doing. But the point is to get quickly back to what you're talking about. And in the third category is actually something you didn't make clear, and then it's important to acknowledge it, reframe it the way they have, restate the point, or say, you're right, footnote, subscript J should have been an I, or subscript J refers to jurisdiction, not time. I'm sorry I didn't make that clear. And I think, 15 or 30 seconds to any question is the most you want to devote to it. If it's longer than that, it's probably a side conversation, and it's distracting from your message. Everyone else is tuned out, unless they're making a point that's something that you didn't make clear. The other thing I would say about audience questions is questions are good. Do not. There's a little bit of a a tenor in our profession right now about questions being hostile. And maybe I've been baked into that environment for too long. Maybe I'm guilty of asking questions too bluntly, or without enough sugarcoating, or I'm used to it. But I really like getting a lot of questions in a talk because it means the audience is engaged. If someone doesn't understand something or I didn't make it clear, I want them to ask me so that I can make it clear, because they're probably not the only one in the room that is confused by it, and I want to bring the whole audience along. If people ask questions that make me reframe how I'm explaining something or restate it, that's good, because the paper will get better. The worst thing that can happen in a job talk or any seminar is you give a talk for an hour and nobody asks any questions. I take that as a sign of disinterest in my paper. And so I look forward to questions. I'm always a little nervous when I give a talk. The first 5 minutes go by, there are no questions. Once people ask questions, we're having a conversation and it's good, and I feel comfortable and I'm at ease on the stage. The first 5 minutes are always a little awkward when I'm the only one talking in the room. Don't fake the answers. Everyone will know it. You'll come off badly. If you don't know the answer, write it down and say, I'll get back to you, and then do get back to them and write back to the person and say, you asked a great question. I should have had an answer off the bat. Here's the answer. It gives you an opportunity to engage with somebody. It gives an opportunity to start a dialogue, and you won't come across as faking something. The worst thing you can do is fake an answer. Your answer should be brief. I said that already. And the other thing is, first talk you give, you'll get questions you hadn't anticipated and may have to write a lot of things down. Second talk, there'll be fewer. By the time you give 3 or 4 talks, you'll have heard those questions before and will have the appearance of giving really informed, off-the-cuff answers to complicated questions. And so that's a reason to practice your job talk as many times as in front of as many audiences as you can. Last thing I'll say is that when I was on the job market, I didn't know any of this, and I didn't follow any of this advice, and I got a job. So don't worry. A lot of this comes with experience. When we see people giving job talks, we know that they're new to this, and so we're not expecting polished, experienced presenters. I think there's a curve in presentation quality. Job market talks are often some of the best presented high quality talks because people give them a lot and put a lot of time into them. Some of the worst talks are given by people like me who've been around the profession for a long time and kind of phone it in and think, well, I can just say whatever I want. Perhaps today's talk is like that. But you're at the beginning, and it's worth practicing a lot and doing a good job in your talk, and I have faith that you will. So I'll turn it over to Paul. I don't know whether you want to ask questions now or open the. I'll turn it over to Tatiana, who can decide whether we answer questions now or move on to Paul.
Yeah, thanks very much, Arik. That was a fantastic presentation. We are going to hold questions until after Paul presents, in case some of them get answered by Paul's presentation. So if you're worried about forgetting your question, just write it down. And I should also say that Paul and Arik did not coordinate on what they're going to present. And so if you hear Paul repeat some of the same things that Arik repeated, that means they're really, really important. And of course, you should pay attention to all of their advice because they're very experienced, but the ones that get, the points that get re-emphasized are particularly those that probably most of the profession agrees on. And so
And if he disagrees with me, we can have a little vote at the end.
yes, and then we can bring that up during Q&A. Those are great points to resolve during Q&A as well. Okay, so I will turn it over to you, Paul. You're muted.
All right, I am just, oh, that was great. I didn't properly, let me just make sure. Can you see it? All set?
Yes.
Didn't properly, I've already got a very boring title here, courtesy of, now I was about to start putting some stickers on here or do something a little more appropriate. This is really, I mean, yeah, to what Tatiana said, there's going to be definitely some re-emphasis. I don't know exactly, Arik and I, main distance from the job market per se, but we'll probably have some slightly different, the further you get away from it, I think the more probably you fail to internalize these aspects. So I want to reiterate at the beginning of this and then at the end that one thing I tell the students is, this talk, doing the talk is important, but it is only one step in the process of a whole paper and then more broadly in your profession. So we're going to optimize on this, but there's only so much that the optimization or changes on this has any impact, and it will, broadly speaking, don't overthink too much on this particular one, just in the sense that you're probably doing the right thing going forward. The fact that you've written a job market paper is already a huge accomplishment, and it's about kind of executing the best that you can on here. So I'm going to talk about really 4 things, and then at the end I just have a slide where I have linked some additional resources that, we're not the first type of people to try and give advice on this. You should always be careful about people giving advice in the sense that there's this strong selection bias of other things that potentially are correlated. It's not obvious that what we're doing is necessarily causal and inherently the best thing, but it comes from experience. I kind of wanted to emphasize a few things. The first is I was just going to try and give a little context for you as the student when you go into the talk, to give you some perspective on what will feel different when you go and give a job talk, because for much of the time, it will be a new experience, and then it will be very different after the job market. You will kind of not experience this again. And so I just want to emphasize that so you can that is going to give you some perspective on it. Then I'm going to kind of talk about some very specific things that are touched on that are kind of the things that I wanted to flag. And at the end, this is a little bit like my talk is a little bit like an actual empirical talk. We're going to talk about some theory. We're going to do some econometric methods like slides and formatting. And at the end, I have 2 empirical applications, namely in that I have all the slides I did the job market twice. And so I can show you some slides and some discussion of what I did for the job market. And we can, with the perspective of hindsight, look at a little bit at the beginning of that and kind of I can talk a little bit of now looking at it, what I would have done differently and what I think was good versus bad. And I could suggest you to do. So let me do that. I think this is just to reemphasize this point of what makes a job talk unique. So the first thing is that, when you're afterwards, when you're faculty or, you're working at a Fed or you're an economist and you're invited to give a talk, traditionally, there will be some group that is interested in the work that you're doing that will have invited you. So what I mean by that is that there are going to be specialists who kind of know or are familiar with your work or are interested in the topic. They're going to be kind of the centerpiece of it. And there's going to be kind of this smooth moving away from people who really know what's going on to further and further away. But if you're a labor economist, you get invited to a labor group, setting up all of kind of the traditional language and discussion that you need amongst labor economists is not really necessary. Versus if you're giving a job talk, really everyone is in the room. The game theorists are obliged to come to the labor economist talk, and they're all economists, but they may not understand the same language. And so if you, for example, start throwing around the word late when you're talking about your empirical estimates, and there's a game theorist in the room and he or she doesn't go to a lot of empirical talks, they may have no idea what's you're talking about, and they may sort of just tune you out. So things like that. This is kind of a rare aspect. And what it means is that you have this particularly fine dance of juggling the complicated and the simple, in the sense that you want to keep things simple and distilled so that everyone has a sense of what's going on and there's a takeaway, but you also want to kind of flex your intellectual muscle to demonstrate to the people who do know your topic that you have what's going on. So that is an important thing to kind of keep in mind in the way that you do the presentation. The second thing is that all talks are stressful. It's like every unhappy family is the same. If I'm going to blow my Anna Karenina references, basically the point is like every talk is stressful, but job talks are particularly stressful because you feel a lot of pressure to impress and you want to get the job there. And so you're going to be more stressed out. It may vary by person depending on your public presentation skills, but it's going to be very stressful. And so practicing becomes even more important in that sense. You are trying to demonstrate sort of aptitude with the material, and the stress that you have there, even if you are kind of a rock star with the material, is going to make it so that you are going to flub on something unless you practice. And so I'm going to get into this later, but like you should practice until you want to scream and never present this again. I cannot emphasize this enough, and I'm going to try and show you through, like, I'm looking back on it and I can't believe I did this, but I think that it paid huge dividends. Just practice and repetition is the way to deal with this. So if you talk to people who work in the theater, if you talk to people who do public speaking, the way that you get over stress in public speaking is that you practice 1,000,000 times so that it becomes a second nature. One big thing that is also going to be different, that is going to feel different, is that it's different from presenting internally. So internally, you may or may not have this sense, but if I give a talk in my seminar, either when I was a student or now when I'm a faculty member, I know who are the people who are going to ask questions that are kind of them just showing off, as Art put it, or is it going to be something where it's like a deep kind of question that I need to spend time thinking about, or some mix in between. The seminar audience for the most part. In a new department, you have no idea. And this kind of uniform, you could look up people beforehand, but you don't have a sense of like what kinds of questions they ask in seminar. Are they aggressive? Are they relatively passive? If they're asking a question in this way, does that actually mean that they believe it, etc.? You have kind of you're behind this kind of veil of ignorance. And so what that's going to mean is that it's just going to feel different. The environment is going to feel different. And the way that you answer questions needs to then respond accordingly. We're going to talk a little bit about how to do that. And then the last thing is that, relatedly, is about time management. You're just going to have limited opportunities to re-explain yourself. When you were a graduate student, right, you present something and maybe it was unclear, and you would go seek out said faculty member in their office and you would talk about them afterwards, and you could kind of explain it to them. You're going to really have limited time to re-explain yourself. And so you want to maximize the amount of time that you have up on the stage. Okay. Oh, sorry. Wrong keyboard. Okay. So let's first talk about crowd management. So this is something I told Tatiana I was going to try and talk about. There's like one thing that I got from graduate school that I was kind of told about that is valuable. So like in crowd management, seminar management is like a skill that can be learned. Some people, right, you see people present seminars and they are just incredibly dexterous at managing questions, right? There are some folks who, given their backgrounds and their public speaking skills, are really good at speaking on their feet. And that's fine. There's different kind of levels of which people will be good at it. But the vast majority, especially for your job talk, is a skill that can be learned. And so the way that I was kind of taught how to deal with this is through preparation, basically something that I'm calling the list in capital letters. I'm going to talk about in just a second, where what you're going to do is you're going to have a sense of exactly what every question is that is going to be asked in your seminar. You are going to know every question of some version, and you are going to have an answer prepared for it. And by knowing some version of that, you are going to be relatively prepared. So the practice and preparation, this is going to be a continual theme. And what I'm talking about is that you are doing everything possible to prepare yourself for success beforehand through repetition and kind of writing things down and preparing the best possible answer. So Eric Zwick has this very nice document that. It's kind of link at the end where he talks about the whole job market. But one thing that I do want to emphasize is about crowd management is that like what you're trying to do is bring kind of your best possible self. So one thing that is very common among students and faculty members, frankly, this is everyone, this is not just students, but I think this is something worth keeping in the back of your mind is it is very easy to feel like a question that is being asked about your paper that is potentially critical, you to feel defensive about it. And so one thing that is really valuable to keep in mind is, so, you know, for example, somebody asks to sort of presage what I'm going to talk. So my first job market paper was something about debtor protections during the crisis. So it was an ex post thing, and I'll talk about what it is. And an important issue with the paper is we didn't do anything with the ex ante. And so fine, I'll get into the details of why that's potentially interesting. But if somebody asks me that, the right answer is not to say, oh, well, that's not important, or like to say like, well, this was really hard already, you know, we're going to focus on this. It's to sort of acknowledge that that's an important aspect of it. We are doing but one piece. No paper is going to sufficiently answer everything. And you want to just bring this clear sense of which you as a colleague are going to be one of these people who has a lot of interesting, like earnest interest in working on lots of questions, in the sense that you're working on this one, and then hopefully you're going to work on this next one. And broadly speaking, you are just interested in developing and maintaining a broad body of knowledge. And so being defensive about questions can be valuable, and sometimes it's impossible to control that. But there is value in kind of trying to be as earnest about this in every interaction that you have. So bringing that energy, whatever you can do to kind of bring that energy is extremely valuable. Okay, so let me talk about what the list is. So I guess I'm going to talk about it in just a second, but I basically started calling this the list based off of, I had a professor in graduate school, his name was Sam Hansen, who he used to describe it as the following. So this metaphor only work, I recognize this as an international audience. So this metaphor is going to require a little bit of setup so that we can describe exactly what's going on. So in baseball, the sport of baseball, we're in the middle of the World Series right now. This is particularly relevant here. In baseball, there is somebody throwing a ball towards a batter, and if they get it in a particular place, that's a strike. Basically, the idea is that you can toss pitches in a particular area, and if it's in the good spot, it's a strike. If it's outside, it's a ball. But the batter, it's easier for them to hit there. There's somebody who calls balls and strikes, and so the person catching it moves their glove around to try and basically fool the umpire. The reason this is relevant is that people are going to ask you questions. There's going to be a set of many, many questions people will ask. But in the end, those questions can kind of all be moved into the strike zone area of somebody asks you a question, and it's very close to a question that you already have heard before. And yes, you could do a slight variation on it, but what you could do instead is you can take the question and you could say, oh, that's, you know, basically what you're asking is X. You restate it in the way that you want to answer it, and then you answer said question. Now, some people might be frustrated. Maybe it's not quite there, but most people, that's what they want to know. They don't exactly know the question that they want to ask, and restating it and giving a clear answer is the best one. And so if you know what these questions are, you can kind of write them down over the course of preparing. And so this is an example. I have a document. It was like 50 pages long, not just with questions, but where it could be, you know, I had questions like, couldn't this all be driven by people taking on more debt beforehand? And then I have an answer that I wrote out, which I practiced, and sort of this is like preparation for both the interviews and and I kind of knew, okay, well, if I get a question about this ex ante response, I can sort of answer with this one. And you can kind of write out your best answer for each of these, and you have like kind of a long list. I just cribbed a particular part of it. And so much of the times, the prepared question that will be more than sufficient for what you need. When I ask a question in seminar, you know, I'm just trying to keep up with what they're presenting. It's not like I have an incisive answer to every question that's there. Sort of what Eric said was, it's not like everybody has read your paper necessarily beforehand, and so is going to really be totally on top of what's going on. The other thing that I will say, and it's probably clear from how chatty I am, is it's like very natural to want to engage and fully answer a person's question. One benefit of writing down the answer and being like, this is what needs to be said and no more, is it also keeps you from talking and talking and talking in response to a question. One thing that happens when you're nervous is it's very easy to keep talking. It's basically what you want to do is keep your answer short and sweet, because the questioner has no sense of managing your time, and you need to sort of answer and then move on. So don't leave discussions open-ended. Answer the question and then move on. That's another benefit of kind of preparing, is that you'll know exactly what you want to say. Now, it is possible that there's going to be a time where you don't have a very good answer. Like somebody who's particularly sharp will think of something new. There are obviously new things and new problems. The other version of this is, there might be something where you don't have a great answer, right? Is like, you might just say like, I don't know. Like, this is like, you think about a challenging question, especially if you have a theory or methods paper, there might be a version of this where you don't know how to do it. And you might speculate a little bit, but you don't want to belabor it. I think an important aspect is to not get flustered about this. A lot of times people feel like you're being evaluated on whether or not you're fast on your feet. It's really about, you want to demonstrate that you kind of understand the question. You can try to answer, but just cut your losses if you don't know the answer. There's no reason to kind of burn time flailing to some extent. Basically be sincere. This is exactly what Arik said, is like, answer that you'll think about it, give the question, answer the questioner with a longer answer later, write it down and try to follow up. Basically, this is a version of, either you want to stop a questioner, you use that to sort of answer and say, we can follow up more, or if you don't know the answer, don't continue to flail. I think everyone can speak to the idea that there's nothing worse than watching a seminar kind of spin around for 5 to 10 minutes around one question. It's kind of, you want to keep moving on, and that's your responsibility as the presenter. Okay, so I've like emphasized this a million times already, but preparation, especially on these job market talks, is 150% of the battle. So there's just so many dimensions in which preparation is going to help you. The other aspect of this, so this is ridiculous, right? So this is the kind of things that goes up on like high school coaches. This is like in these inspiration quote books, right? Success is where preparation and opportunity meet. This is like, success is 100% perspiration. And it's like these ridiculous quotes that just try to emphasize that the only thing that's in your control is preparation. And so that's what you can do. It's not just about making nice slides, but it's about practicing it, anticipating and knowing, so that you're ready when the actual event occurs. And so one aspect of this, for example, of why preparation can be valuable, is knowing how long each part of your talk goes. So Arik was just talking about how it's always better to end early, and you really don't want to end late. Well, practicing really gets it to the extent to which you're like, okay, I have 7 sections in my talk, and I know exactly how many minutes each part takes. And so as a consequence, like, I can use that to manage time accordingly. And so preparation again plays a role here, so that you can then know, okay, well, I ended here early. I can jump to an extended discussion if the audience gives you more time, etc. It's really hard to imagine over preparing in this setting. And so the loop that I think you should be doing for this preparation is something along the lines of: prepare your talk the first time, practice said talk, collect feedback on said talk, document that feedback, and then use it and go repeat step 1 and iterate until the feedback that you're getting in step 3 is exactly the same as all the feedback that you're getting in step 4. I mean, that's pretty much the only way to do it, and until you essentially could do your talk in your sleep. So how did I practice, or how did I do it? So you can practice alone and record yourself, which is excruciating, but I highly recommend it. It is so painful to do this, to watch yourself recorded, but it is extremely valuable. The second is, your classmates or your friends, they owe you, or maybe rather you'll owe them after the fact is probably the better way to put it. You won't owe them, but they won't owe you, but you want to take out a loan on your friendship right now. Have them listen to your talk. And even if they're not somebody who's familiar with it, they will kind of understand pacing and when things are clear and when things are not clear. One thing to do is just really write stuff down. So I was obviously in the middle of really just being very demoralized about the job talk. This was my document that I did. So I, I was acting like a teenager. I wrote this like Descent into Darkness. I had this whole document here where I basically kept track of, I had this many pages. And the first thing that I did was kind of, I just wrote down every comment that people gave me when I would present things. So, these tips are really kind of the sort of thing I would tell students now. So it's practice your first slide over and over, speak clearly and slowly, know what you're going to say. First time I did this presentation, one of my friends told me, okay, you need to control your hands. It's probably very clear, like this is going to be me specific, but try not to be over gesturing, speak slowly. This was about something in the talk, and this was this advice from Sam, treat questions like a baseball, keep your answers short. Obviously, I got that advice again, keep your answers short, etc. So really preparing and having things written down, these are the sort of things that you can then internalize that advice that can be very valuable. The other thing you can do for preparation is you can literally write down every word you're going to say. So you don't have to then say all of those things when you do it, but you'll know what it is. So this is the script from my job market presentation in 2015, where the first opening slide, this italics text, this is kind of like the subtext you'd write, a director would write in a script, but this was what we were told by, we had somebody who was giving us advice on how to do presentation. Strongest point is in the center of the room, be downstage right. You want to be basically be next to you want to be stage right so that people go from left to the right and back to you. You want to have your hands in front of you, make large, round, open gestures, return to closed position. This is kind of the advice that we were getting. We had somebody who our department paid to come in, and he was a former actor. And so it was this kind of, he had turned into somebody who helped giving presentations and was essentially using advice from being an actor of like how to present well. And I had basically in bullet points script of saying like, okay, here's what I was going to say. So on the first slide, I would, know exactly what I was going to say, because it's very easy to kind of spin your wheels. And I would say this, thank you all for coming and inviting me to present my research, etc. And I'll show you what the slides look like for this. But I had just, this was the first slide. The next slide, I had everything written out. This was not what was going to be on the slides, but what I was going to say. And just writing it all out for these first ones really adds it removes stress while the talk is happening if you've practiced it so many times. Okay. This is the point where I would usually say any questions, but we're going to save that for later. So now let me kind of pivot here a little bit. So hopefully the one thing you should take from that, like of what I've said so far, is that preparation will get you a huge amount of the way there, both in terms of managing the crowd and getting you ready for sort of answering questions. The other thing that I think is fun, and I don't want to overemphasize this because, well, first of all, Art did a really great job of kind of emphasizing many of these points already. I have kind of a set of slides that are online that are basically like Beamer templates that you can use. It's, these are not the best. Like I have a co-author now who has these even nicer slides, and now I want to steal his. It's like, this is an iterative thing that you want to work on. Making nice slides is great. Like it feels nice to have cool looking slides up there. I think it is important to realize that like the time you put into slides, the returns on these start to be very concave. It is very easy to spend another 10 hours making your slides look pretty. Though it may be very well possible that it's better to spend that time practicing said slides rather than like making them look a little bit prettier. So the trade-off here is the better you make your slides, kind of one way that you make them better is that you don't need to use them as much as a crutch, which is kind of this point that Arik was saying, is like the more text that you have on there, the more you're using it as a crutch. For example, right now I have a lot of text on my slides, in part because I'm reading from them a little bit because I'm using them as a crutch. When you have practiced so many times, you know what you want to say, and it's just up there to kind of help the audience see what your results are. And so this is kind of the main things that I have in these Beamer tips. I just want to kind of show you the takeaway here. So one is, better to make one point well on a slide. So it's like simplicity on a slide is really useful. So if you have a slide where you're kind of saying one thing, that is way better than the alternative where you have a slide like this. So it's even better to have a picture of a Nobel Prize winner here. But, having that much text on there, the audience checks out, etc. And you're basically reading from it. So don't, better to have one point well than overwhelm an audience with text. The next thing, and this is something I've like tried to emphasize on here, I think is underappreciated, but like color blindness and kind of the types of colors you use in your slides can actually be like very helpful for contrasting and for emphasizing. There's a reason why things look so great when we read things in the New York Times or on the Washington Post, right? They make these amazing figures that have nice colors and do a good job contrasting and so forth. It's actually, there's a lot of tools in being able to make things with nice colors. You don't have to use like the Stata or all our defaults on these. And there's a lot of really useful examples. And so just using traditional red, blue colors can be bad for people who are colorblind. So there's a lot of places where you can kind of crib from to look at these. This is what I use. If you basically are just trying to use a default, I don't even know if these are necessarily the best. This is just what I end up using, this blue and red, and I have this green here if I need a third color. Just being consistent about it can be very helpful to kind of focus on it. And I'm going to reference at the end is a book by John Schwabish, who talks about writing good presentations and making good graphs. And one of the things he kind of talks about is the need to use these colors to make emphasis. Okay, this is like next point here. Don't change the font. This is like what happens. You probably have experienced this as you're writing up your job market paper. I know Arik and Tatiana have experiences. You're like writing a paper and you're doing your exhibit table at the end, and it's a big exhibit table. And so you're like, okay, well, I need it to fit on one page. So I'm just going to shrink the font size so that it fits all onto one page. And so I do like script size and I make it so that it's all tiny. In some ways that's okay for a paper, although it's questionable. On here, it's very natural. You're like, okay, well, I need to put the table in here, or I need to do whatever. You need to, being consistent on font size across your presentation is really valuable. And one of the things is if you're changing your font size, you're probably putting too much text in it. If you have a busy slide, make it a backup, then you can click on it and then the audience will regret ever doubting you. This is true for graphs too. So one of the things that comes up is people will use the same graphs from their paper in their talks. And so then you'll have these axes here that are very hard to read. So here you can't read the axes and the labels. This looks a little bit better, but like obviously this is much better. It'll look too big to you when you're on your computer, but when you're in person and presenting on this projector, it looks very different. One thing to do here is that you can kind of emphasize things. Say you're an empiricist or you're kind of trying to explain something. Pictures are always much nicer. I mean, we used to do things on chalkboards, but pictures are always much nicer way of doing this. And so doing things, having one or two nice diagrams or designs to kind of talk about what you're doing can be really useful. This is how I just did this thing to kind of describe what's going on with difference and difference. I think, you don't have to do it necessarily in every kind of part of your paper, but even on something that's simple, it can be nice to kind of clearly emphasize what's going on and where your treatment and your control group is and what's going on. And then sort of same point stands here is, if you're putting up equations or math, really try to add color and text to highlight or kind of make clear what's going on in the particular paper. So this is Angus 94 thinking about late. Well, maybe you want to kind of emphasize certain parts of it. And so you say, okay, well, I want to highlight and use colors to talk about different parts of it. And then finally, I was talking about with time management with an appendix, you can use that to layer a talk. We were talking about time management and knowing when you need to move on or not. Having links within it with an appendix or backup slides can be a really useful way to do this. So, and then you click on a thing like here, okay, enough already, move on. And then we go on to the next one. So let me, in the last couple of minutes, just talk about, every paper and talk is different. So to some extent, I'm giving you really from a background of having done like applied micro, a little bit of macro, and some econometrics. They're going to look different, like talks look different. But for every talk, kind of the binding constraints are audience members are going to be most focused during the first 10 to 20 minutes of your 70 to 90 minute talk. Econ talks have a culture of clarifying questions, and we're not great at remembering details. So what's the consequence of that? Well, You want to have a mini version of your talk within the first 15 minutes so that when people are fresh, they kind of have gotten to see most of what you're doing. You don't want to be vague in your setup, because if you're vague, then people are going to jump on it trying to like understand what's going on. Better to not say something than to be vague. And you want to have 1 to 3 concrete takeaways. This is stuff that Ark just said. So let me kind of show 2 sets of slides very quickly with the benefit of hindsight with these ideas in mind. Let's abstract from the research quality. You may or may not like my research papers. That's obviously the most important part, right? If you write a killer research paper and the slides are not so great, it's not the end of the world. Think of it more of having really nice slides. If your paper is, good, is really going to help differentiate yourself. I can kind of show you how it changed as well, pre-job market versus within the job market. So here was kind of this first set of slides that we did here. So this was so I went on the job market twice. This is 2015. I went on the job market. I had these slides here. I had this, reasonably bad title. The kind of thing I want to emphasize is not so much on the title here, but here's what I started with. I started with this motivation slide. And one of the things that I think I really want to emphasize here is that I really belabored the motivation here. So it was kind of consumer debt. Is that there was just a lot of text here where if I was going to read this all out and describe it in full detail, this would take me a good 2 minutes. And it's really not obvious that I needed to go into quite so much detail. So I'd say, consumer debt is at high levels. Here's what it's at. It's important for this. I'm really kind of walking the audience member through the argument with text on the slide. So first I'd say consumer debt is high. Consumer debt matters for the macroeconomy. Debtor protections are maybe important for delevering. And we don't really know the interaction between debt and broad macro outcomes. I basically really took somebody's hand and wrote down everything and put it up on the slide. This was really a crutch for me as a PhD student. So this was during my talk to the faculty internally, and it's probably not useful for the audience. There was no hook in this to kind of be like, okay, in slide 1, that's interesting. Like my attempt at a hook was to say, oh, there's limited evidence on this interaction. It's like, okay, well, that's not very interesting. And so when I was giving the talk on the job market, when I had edited this, I think one thing that I did was, all of that motivation was kind of subjugated into one bullet point with some subpoints. Is household debt was a big deal in the recent recession. And then there's the policy question, make explicit the subtext, which is, does debt relief help mitigate this debt overhang in the recession? And then the hook was, well, a lot of times when people think about debtor protections is that they're thinking about idiosyncratic shocks, but we want to think about aggregate shocks. And that's the hook for it. And, the first takeaways here was, the one thing that we could have done is, given modern projectors, we could have made this wider. You can see all of my stuff is very narrow. That's because it's all 4x3. But otherwise, this is much tighter. I think did a very good job of kind of doing the part quickly. Tatiana, I know I'm going over now. So how many more minutes do you want me to go? I'm doing a bad job of time.
You can keep going.
Okay.
It's about 30 minutes.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. All right. I will finish off this section. Could have done more practice is the big takeaway for time management. So now think about it with the script. So what did I have here? So, what I was basically saying here is I said, okay, well, thank you all for coming and for inviting me to present my research. This is co-authored with Will Dobie, my former classmate at Harvard. And then I would say, what's the one-line takeaway from my paper? This is the sort of thing you'd say if you met somebody in the elevator. Well, in this paper, we study how debtor protections affected consumers' ability to deleverage and consume during the recent recession. And then what I really want you to think about is look at the difference between how many words are in the script versus how much is on the slides. You can really, if you write down and you think hard about what you want to say, you can have very complicated, full paragraph ways of talking about your slides that don't require you to read off the slides, but it requires you to practice, right? So I get to this slide and I can say the past decade has been very notable with respect to consumer debt. The year 2008 was marked by the highest levels of consumer debt and the beginning of one of the worst recessions. A significant body of researchers had argued that this high level of household debt worsened the severity of the recession by forcing debtors to save dramatically and reduce overall consumption. An important policy. And so that whole paragraph is that one piece, but kind of much more tightly brings it all together where, those numbers are kind of just sitting there as scaffolding rather than being something that I'm reading. And then it sort of keeps going. And then on the next slide, we have this research. I have one slide that says, research question, which is, namely, we ask the question, what is the empirical effect of consumer data protections on household balance sheets? So, and there it is right there. So I think the main thing to take away from this, if I could emphasize one piece of looking back at this, is that writing out what you're going to say, especially for the first 15 minutes of your talk, is going to let you carefully and clearly highlight what your paper is about in a way that just putting it on the slides is not going to let you sort of guessing what you're going to say, or kind of just ad-libbing as you go along. It's not going to be nearly as clear or nearly as tight. So, what did we do next? So after that is, well, what was our research question? I think it's really nice in a lot of settings if you can, within slide 2, say, what's our research question? And it's X, what is the effect of data protections on household balance sheets and regional macro outcomes? That can be really valuable because at least it will shut down any person who's going to be, after 3 slides, saying, what's your research question? And then finally, in the first set of the slides, this is from the pre-job market one, I kind of previewed the results. So I was emphasizing, right, how you want to, like, in the first 10 to 15 minutes, say what's going on so that if people check out, they know what the answer is. And so I sort of go through, I use this kind of reveal to show what's going on in the slides. And that's fine. I kind of talk about all the pieces. One thing that's going on here, though, is it's like, there's a good summary. There's kind of this iteration explaining what's going on. But by the end of it, there's kind of many moving pieces. So this paper, I had these 2 types of protections. It was not really clear what was going on. If you didn't know anything about bankruptcy or recourse mortgages, I was already introducing ideas that were complicated, and it was very hard to follow all the pieces. And there was a lot of text on one slide, and so it was hard to distinguish. And so, in the second version of it, it still had the same empirical research question. And then what I tried to do is I broke it up. So I said, okay, first let's talk about it. And throughout the kind of the course of the talk, for these 2 types of protections, I had basically this color coding scheme throughout everything. That anytime we referred to mortgage protections, we did this in red. So that people would be like, all right, I don't know what mortgage protections are really. All that I just know is that it protects, this from mortgage creditors and vice versa. But there's the red thing and the blue thing. And then people could keep track of, okay, there's the red thing and the blue thing, talk about the data. And when I showed the results, so notice here that what I did was I kind of split this up into multiple slides rather than dumping it all into one place. Talked about the empirical strategy. And then when I kind of talked about the result, I kind of tried to use these colors again when I was kind of emphasizing what's going on. And so red had this negative effect, blue had this positive effect. So I think of this as being tighter. Now kind of looking at it, it's still not obvious why I had to have so much detail. I think some of this was really trying to avoid somebody's going to walk out in the first 15 minutes. I think now it would not be my strategy to get into quite so much detail. I would probably say have a 1-line bullet point, which would be maybe just, here's my methodology. We're going to be using cross-state variation in this and try and deal with these 2 identification concerns. And kind of talking about the results would be kind of the main issue. So let me, in the last minute, then just say, just because I got older doesn't mean I necessarily wrote better paper or better presentation. So this is my job market paper that I did this was like a paper that I wrote and I used it on the job market. It was not really a job market paper per se, where we were talking about doing stuff about credit reports. The only thing I want to just take away from this is, so fine, is another incredibly boring intro slide, like what Ark was talking about. Much better would have been like one of my cool figures here. But of course, at the Fed, you always had to have this thing at the bottom. The big thing here on this one, and so I started with the motivation, like before. There's this enormous increase in credit registries. Credit registries are important. They're used for non-lending decisions. Basically, like hand-holding a person through why one would care of this. And then on the next slide, I would say, okay, well, what are the consequences of credit registries? There's been debate about this. And then another slide where you'd say, and the media has been paying attention to this, a long shadow of bad credit in a job search, bad credit affects job applicants, yada, yada, yada. and then the legislative response. And then I had this, 4 or 5 slides in, I would say this lack of evidence whether the anecdotes linking credit reports to employment represent a broad-based causal phenomenon. Frankly, looking at it now, I'm like, wow, that is a lot of time on motivation. And one of the reasons why I think that's problematic is the talk really doesn't succeed at linking this broader policy question to like a deep economic question. So the point of this paper was to say like, all right, well, people have a bad credit, maybe bad credit report because they filed for bankruptcy, for example. Is that keeping them from getting a job? Well, fine, we can kind of talk about from a policy standpoint what's going on there. But what's like the economic question that's going on? Well, it's like a signal in one market. Is that useful for another? None of that kind of gets talked about in this intro slides. And if you don't care about household finance, then you might just find this extremely boring. You'd say, okay, well, why do I care about this? Especially thinking about, for example, if you have a game theorist in the audience, it's one thing if it's a bunch of finance faculty or a bunch of household finance people, but it's possible that people would get bored. And so I actually think that it was much tighter on the kind of that previous set of slides, my 2015 slides. This one was kind of the consequence of having presented many, many times previous to that in an audience where people were very familiar and cared about this. And so that's something worth keeping in mind. Oh, sorry, it's the same thing. So let me just end here. I'm over. I just gave some links here. I would say that John Schwabis has actually 2 books that are great. Better Presentations is one of them, which is just like really great stuff about how one should be thinking about presentations. He also has a very nice book about graphic design, which is talking about how to make good figures, which I think is really useful. And then there's some really nice other documents here. So Justice Shapiro has kind of this canonical one. Eric Zwick has these kind of public goods about just the market more generally. And Amanda Agan has a bunch of stuff about how to present. So this is where some of these are also there, and there's some additional ones as well. I think one of my favorite ones is Rachel Meager's slides on public speaking for academic economists, which everyone should definitely read. And that's it. I will hand it back over to you, Tatiana.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Paul and Arik. We'll now open it up for questions. So you can either raise your hand or type your question in the chat, or if you'd like to ask your question anonymously, you can send it to me as a private chat. Okay, Adam, go ahead.
Hi, I have a question about the notes in tables that we present. How detailed do the notes in the tables for the slides have to be compared to what they would be in the actual paper?
You can go first. Go first, Eric. I have opinions, but yeah, you should go first.
I don't put any. I mean, the notes are things like sources, details about how standard errors are calculated. Like, what would you want people to read? Is if it's not words you're going to say out loud. Well, if it's words you're going to say out loud, you don't need to put them there. And what I can't think of a scenario in which you want people reading the footnotes of a table.
Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would say, I mean, I've been guilty of not following this advice, but I think there's even a world of it, like in some settings, if you can put your numbers not even as a table or as like a figure, like there's even more extreme versions of it where you can like take the number out and you can just say what the number is. Like it's unclear why the tabular formatting for it is even better necessarily. Like, we're very comfortable with it, but like if you can put it in a figure version of it or something, like there's even more extreme ways of doing it. I think there's like no value whatsoever. You should avoid, to the extent that you can, putting anything that looks like the tables in your draft in your presentation. I mean, sometimes you're just limited on time, but on your job market presentation, you have so much time you can kind of iterate on it. There's almost no reason you should. I think that's in line with what you're saying, more or less.
Yeah, I guess I'm not quite so extreme. My strategy has been to create an excerpt of the table, so it looks like looks like table 1, table 7 in the paper, which is the key table. It'll have the same columns and rows, but I'll only show the coefficients that I'm presenting.
Yeah.
No footnotes, no de-emphasized standard errors, no other correlates that aren't relevant.
Yeah, you should definitely just emphasize only the things that matter for the talk. And if they care about these other things, they should have the paper like easily. Now everybody has a phone. I mean, one of the things that's kind of crazy about this is like now everybody has a phone in front of them. There's so many, it's like there's no reason that they can't go look this stuff up if they really want to, or they can just ask you if it's really they care about the details on the clustering of the standard errors, for example.
Good question.
Okay. Thanks. And we have a question in the chat. What do you think is the distribution of % of job market paper read by faculty attending a job talk?
That's a great question. Read, and we have to define what read means. Maybe we can give two definitions for read. Like one version of read is like read the introduction and skimmed the exhibits. And another version is like read it cover to cover, like read the full draft. And then I guess the last version of read is like read it as if you're a referee. That last one, I would say it's like near zero. Maybe the people who are like on the admission, on the committee, the candidate committee, like I will have read the paper. If I'm the person in the first round who is responsible for that paper, I will have done my best to have read everything pretty carefully. So near zero, I would, yeah, I for that part. And then for like having read the intro, maybe, I don't know, 15%. What do you think? Is that too much?
No, I think it's right. It's a small fraction. Keep in mind, I go to a lot of job talks by people whose fields I don't really know very well. So an econometrician or a macroeconomist, it's a waste of my time to try to read the technical details of the paper. So it's not an indictment of people for not having read it. I'll read the introduction, and my hope is that they can appeal to a broad economic audience.
Yeah, and this is something I think speaks to a little bit of like the paper, and this is also like why the like first part of the talk is so important. Like we are gonna both emphasize in different ways, like the for intro part of it, as well as like later, is like in some ways you're trying to give the less technical version early on so everybody understands the like kind of key conceptual contribution of your paper without having to be able to follow all the technical details. And so similar, like your first couple of paragraphs, your intro of your paper should be like following the same role. So if your motivation for a paper is like, I'm doing a contribution on top of some technical detail that's in my field, it's going to be very hard for those of us who don't know anything about your field to kind of follow what's going on. And that's why it's like not a useful way to present your work. I agree. Yeah, not an indictment.
Other questions? I'll jump in with a question while we have more. So, it can be hard for students to know how much material to prepare. So for an hour and a half job talk, how long would you say your own talk should be kind of accounting for questions, and how to maybe think about different audiences that may be more or less lively?
Well, let me start by telling you kind of a horror story that happened to me related. So I think we get told, and I did the right, like, I think most people struggle with time management of not talking too much because we've done a lot. And I think what happened, my job market paper was not as kind of fleshed out as it should have been because I wrote it so late in my 2015 one. And when one of the talks I gave, I finished 15 minutes early, and I didn't realize because it was like on a weird scheduling thing. That I wouldn't recommend. I think that was probably a signal more of like the actual, like it wasn't a causal, I didn't finish 15 minutes early and then they were like, oh, well, he finished 15 minutes early, that was the problem. But probably I didn't spend enough time on some details. So I think probably what, the right amount of material to do is as much as you can, but like this is going to iterate as a function of how much you have to explain and kind of defend certain. This is part of why this idea of, I have a core idea of my paper, 3 follow-up portions, and then they have many, many technical details on top of it. The extent to which the audience lets you do more or less of those things is gonna drive it. And that's why practicing it and then having something where you have ability to access that material subsequently is going to be really important. I mean, Art, do you kind of agree with that or disagree?
I have a little bit of a nuanced take on it. I feel like, and there's nothing you can do about this in a job market, but maybe be sensitive to it. It's weird in our profession that there's this hour-and-a-half norm, because not all subjects need an hour and a half. And my classic example is like in development economics, when people are doing randomized control trials. They have a question: does giving people money to build, clean drinking water fountains raise health 2 years later? There's no economic, I don't have to do a lot of econometrics. I have to convince you that that I randomized appropriately, show you the data before and show you the data after 15 minutes. But I need to fill an hour and a half, and so it's often a lot of pictures of the happy villagers and things that are fillers. So, what's the example in empirical economics? People spend a lot of time on things that they spent a lot of time on. So if you did a heroic effort to merge two data sets, and they came from different sources and they had different labels, and you had to scrape this and you had to use an algorithm to match text, that's great. Congratulations. But you don't have to spend a lot of time on it. It's not key. There's no economics in it, and it's not key to what you've done and telling your story. And so there's a temptation to spend a lot of time on things that were time intensive for you but aren't important. I don't know. I've never had I think that in empirical economics, there's enough robustness checks and extensions that you can do if you have time, but you don't need to do to tell your story, that you can be quite flexible. And so I've always had, things I do if I have time, and I never do them. That's it.
I'm torn on this in that there is a very weird part of this that is the job market is a little bit like show-offy, relatively speaking. I don't know if this is like a norm that is a good thing, that like, but there is an element to which, like, in some ways it's almost about like showing stuff that you've done. I agree completely with this idea of like, you don't want to kind of do things just because they took a lot of time, but kind of similar to this like presentational thing is that like your job market presentation almost in some ways feels different than a regular paper presentation. And so to this point, like, I think the biggest, most important thing is being able to demonstrate like a clear grasp of the material and be able to communicate it. Then the next valuable thing is to kind of show that you have like spent time kind of figuring out lots of pieces of it. You still want to be presenting about the economics of it, but like if you can think of interesting facts, or if they're like interesting pieces that you want to do on, that's the kind of thing you want to be able to reference. I don't think of another robustness check. It's like, let me show you 800 different additional things.
Yeah.
But I do think if it's like, there's additional interesting facts that are not the centerpiece of it, that's like a useful thing that you can then use as an aside, and that will like stimulate conversation. And you can choose to omit that if the time is not appropriate for it. One thing that's challenging about it, it's a little bit like when the talk is going well, you're going to get a lot more questions, and then you're not going to present as much material. And so to some extent, when the talk is like, maybe the audience is just not engaging with it as much, it doesn't mean it's going poorly. You are not going to, you kind of want to not necessarily belabor stuff in the audience as well. It may just be like, they like you, but they don't want to see every detail of this particular paper. So you don't want to spend a huge amount of time on it either. So there's some value in ending early. Anyway, that's a long kind of follow-up point on what Arik is saying. I think that's right.
I liked your addendum, which is that the extra stuff you have should be substantive and not just boring robustness checks. That's good.
I think, the other thing that I will say, and this is common for job market talk, at least in empirical, like the analogy I'm thinking of is like, So in difference in difference literature now, there's like this big lit now, right? Thinking about difference in differences, applied econometrics literature, like what do you do when you have heterogeneous treatment effects and difference in difference? And it's almost like a signaling thing that this is like this thing of like a bunch of robustness checks. You don't inherently want to like be like, and look, we did all the robustness checks on this. What you're trying to do is it can be valuable to signal to the audience that you understand and you want to talk about these potential threats to your identification, but you don't want to be like, we do the normal thing, and then I'm going to show you another slide where I go through 100 different like estimators from the literature in order to do it. There needs to be some kind of like middle ground where you want to just demonstrate grasp of the material. I'm just thinking of that because I've seen that in talks before.
So to follow up on that, would you recommend having extra slides that you could go to, or just having slides that you can skip when you are presenting in case there's
that was kind of emphasis. So when you, maybe I wasn't explicit enough in it. The former. So in those kind of the presentation I was giving and in those Beamer ones that I have, and I presume PowerPoint is something similar and other presentation softwares, I think you should be, you should have them at the end of your deck, and you should only go to them if conditional on knowing how much time you have in your talk, you have extra time and you can kind of spend some time kind of talking about these additional features of your data. Or skipping is, you should not skip. You should have really like one main version, and some people get the extended cut depending on the size of like most people are getting the main cinema release, movie theater release of your paper. Like that's the expectation.
Okay. So we have a question in the chat. How to decide the trade-off between structuring the talk to impress specialists in my area, putting emphasis on the technically hard parts, versus keeping technicals to a minimum so as to not lose other economists?
Paul should talk. My papers are not very technical, so I don't have this problem.
I think that in a job talk, putting it up on the slides is not really the most impressive thing that you can do as a technical person, is making a technical thing seem simple or like explaining it well. I mean, I think that's right. Like, that's the thing. Like, if you do that, you're going to be talking about the technical thing anyway in like a clear way, and you'll have translated it. You already have done the hard thing in the paper. And then if you've translated it, then it's like even more impressive. And then the technical people may ask you a follow-up, and you're good enough with it that you can talk about it in the technical language. But I think that is, I mean, that's not always possible. Like sometimes you'll be like, okay, I'm going to show you, thinking about this econometric thing, I'm going to show you a theorem, the semi-parametric efficiency bound. You might have a couple slides of it, but the extent to which you can keep things as clear and as concise as possible. There was once this, I can't remember who said this. There was some story about theory, like this idea is like theory, there's this element of like theory that it's like, you're taking something that's simple and then you make it hard when it's in the theory, but the hardest part of it is not the moving it into the hard part, it's then translating it and bringing it back into something simple. And it's like, that's the part, as for the technical, is bringing it back into the world where everybody understands kind of what's going on. And that's like a function of time. Like you may not always know how to do that, and that takes practice. That's the other value of practicing it and doing it in front of people who don't know the material, is that, and do it with people who are comfortable being like, I don't understand what you're talking about, or like, I don't get it. Do that as much as you can.
I think you said the magic words, which is that if you can make the technical thing, if you can provide the intuition for people who don't know what it's about, that's the golden ticket.
Yeah. Let me give you an example of a student who I think has an amazing job market paper here, who I've like seen him prepare for. This is an econometrics thing, is like most of his paper, there's lots of clever ways in which he makes it clear. And then he was like, I have this lemma on tensor inequalities. Should I put that in the talk? And it's like, first of all, there's no way that you're going to make that intuitive to anyone in the audience. And it's just like not obvious why one, I mean, it would be really, it's really impressive, but it's just, there's no, you can make an aside. You can be like, to do this proof, I like proved a new lemma, but there's just no value in presenting that. And then there's no way for an economist to make it like, make that intuitive even. So anyway, sorry, let's just like give an example.
Great. Thank you. So we have a question in the chat. Under extreme circumstances, some faculty may interrupt presentations to ask questions all the time, maybe intentionally to put pressure on the presenter. What should we do, and what do we need to pay attention to?
I think one thing, go ahead,
Go
Paul.
ahead, Ark. No, please.
One thing you should appreciate, if there is somebody like that in the room, you're not the only person who notices it. And other faculty and students will find that annoying as well. I mean, I don't know the answer of how to deal with it, but I've been, not on the job market, but just go to give a seminar at a place where there's somebody who just feels the need to ask a question every 2 minutes. And after the seminar and out to dinner or talking to people apologized to me about that person. That's an extreme case. I don't know what you do about it. Acknowledge the question, write it down.
This is, I mean, I would say that the main thing that you can do, and this is part of why practice and it's just like going in is, I think exactly what Art said. It's like, there's not a coordinated effort on the part. Speaking as someone like, I think all the faculty on this call, because it's not like we get together beforehand and we're like, all right, how are we going to really grill this, this job candidate in her talk? There are just people personality wise. It may also be that particular day, etc. And one thing to keep in mind is like, you should, to the extent that you can, your material very well. You should defend where you think is important. You should not take it personally on any of these things that they're saying. It's the same way that if you met someone who is very antagonistic, don't let them throw you off your game. And if it's really hurting you time-wise, there's no harm in saying, I really want to get through my material. Why don't I take a couple, give me some time to kind of get through this. I think some of your questions might get answered later on, and then I'll come back to you if that becomes an issue. I think the vast majority of people will take the hint there. And if it's not, then a faculty member should somebody else in the audience will say. I have to imagine that's the case. I know it's very easy to think of the worst case scenarios, and it feels like sometimes when you're a PhD student that those things are going to happen. I've had some really bad job talks, but even then, if I said something like, I think I understand what you're doing, or maybe I don't understand your question, but let me kind of get through a couple more of this, and then we're going to revisit this later on, and I'll follow up with you. And if it's still not clear, let's talk a little more, or we can talk afterwards. And then just kind of put the strong period at the end of your statement there. You can even practice. You should practice it, write it down, and say exactly what you're going to say, and practice saying it out loud so that you know what you're going to say, even if you're flustered, and you just move on. And it's not fun, but it just happens. Is sometimes you meet people who are going to be like that.
But it's also pretty rare, right?
It's very rare. Yes. I know of one, I can still think of one department that was like that, but I've given a lot of talks. And it's the same way you have one example that it's like over a long, long set of talks. It's very rare. Don't emphasize that one. Just know what you're going to say at the end of it, I think.
The other thing I would say is people are very nervous about the job market, but I get more nervous presenting a paper to my colleagues in my own department than going somewhere where I don't necessarily know anyone. Worst case, you're never going to see these people again. It's fine. I'm more nervous about my colleagues who I have to, see every day for the rest of the year if I do something that I regret. So just go out and have fun. If people are asking questions most of the time, that's a great sign that they're interested in your work and want to understand it better.
Yeah, I think that's a thing that is hard to internalize, is that questions are good. It means people are engaged and interested. It's far worse to have silence in the room than the alternative in many ways. So like it's hard. I know I'm very conscious of like how hard it is to feel that way. But yeah, I think that's right. And having that attitude will also make you more at ease to the extent that you can have that attitude, and then you will be a better presenter as a consequence too. So something to keep in mind.
I will add one thing from myself as, if you do have a very adversarial audience member or more, and nobody steps in to try to, control it and help you out, that is also a signal about the department. Now,
Yes.
of course, your goal is to get as many offers as possible. You may or may not have the luxury of selecting based on how the talk went, but departments are also trying to attract candidates, and they should be trying to make sure that conditions are appropriate for them to be able to give a talk.
Totally. It's a matching process.
Yeah. Okay. Other questions? I'll ask questions. I'll ask a logistical questions about practicing. So how do you practice? Do you run through the whole talk at once? Do you split it up so that you don't get tired? Would you suggest trying to get other students to come and listen or practice by yourself? Can you talk a little bit about kind of the more logistical details of practicing?
So Paul talked about it a little bit, and I totally concur. I've been doing this for 3 decades, and I still, if I'm going to give a talk somewhere, I set a timer, I practice it at home, I practice in my hotel room, and I do the hour-and-a-half talk. It's boring. It's awful. And it gets so, I go to the workout room in the morning at the hotel, and I'm doing the talk in my head, and I go for a walk in the evening and I do the talk in my head. And I don't have a job at stake, but it's I want to do well. So I don't practice the whole hour-and-a-half talk a bunch of times, but I do that at least once or twice, and then I'll do the opening many times.
Yeah, the opening, I mean, that's advice I got early on, and I just like want to reiterate. It's like practicing the whole thing is valuable, but I would say even writing down, it depends on kind of, I have a nervous tick in that I talk too much when I'm nervous, or like it's the first time doing it. And so like writing down even a version of what you're going to say helps discipline kind of what I'm going to do. And I don't spend too much time on the intro slides. It's very easy to do that. I kind of did a little bit of that today. I spent too much time early on. And relatedly, to just from a logistical point, as you were asking, Tatiana, is that there is an aspect, obviously, when you give a full 90-minute talk or 80-minute talk, whatever the norm is now, you should do it once through. Your aim is that will be a 45 to 50-minute talk and then adjust accordingly. But kind of if I were going to tell someone how to do it, is I would write for the job market, I would write down, I mean, I have the document here. What I did for mine was I really wrote it I wrote out the words only for the first 5 slides, which were my intro slides. I didn't write out the script for everything, but to some extent, like that's the talk, right? The intro is the talk just condensed down. And then the rest, you're having a conversation where you're describing what you did to get to those points. But you can almost think of your intro slides as the version that you would give uninterrupted in a world in which, many departments have a norm where you're not allowed to interrupt for the first 5-10 minutes. And so then you can almost think of that as like that you should kind of have nailed down. That's a 10-minute thing in which you kind of give your motivation, you give your approach, your research question, and then you give your results, and then you can kind of move on. And you want to practice the rest of it to make sure that your slides are clear. But that's sort of the only piece. If you really want to just absolutely crush it, you should write down everything, but that's like excruciating. Nobody wants to do that. And one comment I would say is, because I keep emphasizing this, and this is something I'm like saying, write it down. the story that people say about writing it down, if you're a person who, for example, you're not a good public speaker, it's even better to write it down. But the problem is that people worry that it feels stilted. By practicing, it will no longer be stilted. So like you'll write it down and you will feel like you're reading from a script, and then you'll read it 100 times, and then it will no longer feel stilted anymore because you have it memorized and you can just do it in your sleep. Like when I was, for the first year after the job market, I could still recite my spiel from sleep. Like it was just like you had said it so many times. My name is Paul Pinkham. My research is on X, blah blah blah. I don't remember anymore, thank goodness. So that's just something to get like. We had somebody who the department brought in to help us with this, and he really emphasized this in a way that I think helped me. So I want to just encourage this to you, is that like preparation here is so helpful, especially if you're a person who gets nervous about these things, because it will just get you to a point where you're not, like, even if you're nervous, your body will kind of go into it will just go into autopilot.
Right.
I think a version of what you said is that, I often write down what I'm going to say and practice it. And then I bring that piece of paper with me to the seminar, but I never look at it because it's basically effectively memorized. And so it seems more unscripted.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not like it's bad if you forget. Like the other thing too is it's bad if you go off script or something. It's not the end of the world, but it's just giving you guidance of what you're going to try and do. And a version of this, I guess we said this before, but I want to reemphasize this because it's so hard to remember this on the other side of it, is that like, it feels like an antagonistic relationship, but really for the most part, we're like what you're trying to do is present the best version of your paper because people are excited to see your work. And so like getting faculty enthusiastic about your paper gets them, it's like a love fest kind of thing. Like you want people to be excited about your paper and they're excited to see, like, there's just like an enthusiasm. You want enthusiasm in what's going on. It's not necessarily that like it's a gauntlet that we're trying to like kind of beat you up in. And if you make it to the finish line, then it's there. It's like you're trying to engender kind of this intellectual environment where people feel excited about your work. I don't know if that totally makes sense, but it's very hard to keep that perspective in mind when you're trying to get a job from somebody else.
Thanks. We have time for one or two more questions.
One anecdote, if people are thinking of questions, I have a co-author who is a Jesuit priest, and we were working on a talk, and he had a stopwatch and he was timing me. Oh, you just spent 7 minutes on the introduction. Isn't that too much? You spent 10 minutes on this section. Isn't that too much? And this is how he does his sermons for Sunday morning. And so I think it should be at least as rigorous when you're doing an economics talk.
That's pretty good. I'd love to know what his sections are. It's like
Right.
practice a lot for his sermons.
Data, methods.
Yeah, exactly.
Conclusions.
He doesn't have quite the same antagonistic audience members, I guess, in quite the same way. Depends on, it depends, I guess, on the congregation.
They may not be as vocal.
Yeah. The one comment related to this that is about it's just that one comment that I've given to students, and so then I want to just communicate, is that there's sometimes you think about like when should you be working on what. So like this is great that Tatiana is setting this up now. There's an aspect to which is kind of, you've been working on your paper, we're in November now, so people are going to start submitting their packets basically now. There's kind of multiple stages, right? So you've been writing the paper, and then you gave your internal talk to your internal faculty and the people who are going to be writing you letters. That's probably happened at this point. Now you're going to submit your packet. Over the next 2 months until interviews, a version of your talk, like you have a version of your talk, but I would say, you know, your talk is valuable to work on now, but the kind of the logistics of it, of like prepping for the interview or interviews, is really valuable. And then when the interviews end, there's going to be kind of a couple weeks there. Well, it depends on how kind of when the interviews occur, but at least a week or two in which you're going to have post-interview pre-flyouts. And in that time period, I know it's like the holiday season, but it's really, you gotta, other than a little bit of family time, like try to block out, like, this is when you have like this, you've already done the talk, you're not gonna improve the paper, you're just like, you're like a actor or actress memorizing their lines. And so from a logistical standpoint, you know, the slides hopefully are close to being ready, but like there's maybe some tweaking you can do. But really it's about like nailing the presentational part of it down post interviews. And there's some like flexibility there, but I do think that there's a necessary condition in which to get a flyout, you have to nail the interview. And so you want to kind of prep as much as you can for the interviews in the next month as well. So that's just I get this question about like, how much should I be spending on one versus the other? And clearly there's spillovers between the two, but you do want to like really as much as you can emphasize the interview for right now, and then that will pay dividends in the way that you structure your talk.
Okay. Well, I think we should wrap up now. Thank you to everybody for coming. I'll stop recording.